This is the eighth in a series of talks about why it's difficult for me and for many people to understand China and the Chinese, the gulfs of separation. It's based on my book, Understanding the Chinese, and other books on understanding the English A to Z. And in this talk, I want to explain why, in some ways, it's terribly easy to understand China. This is a point made in another way when de Tocqueville, the French philosopher, sociologist, visited America. He said, although America is huge and diverse in its geography and everything else, it's actually very easy to understand. It's like a great wood in which you can stand in the middle, and because it's very simply arranged and symmetrical, you can stand in the middle and you can look down various structural features like equality and liberty and fraternity, and you can read off almost all the American institutions and modes of life from a few simple principles like a grammar. In contrast, he said, I will never understand England, though I'm married to a French wife and love the place and go there, because its history is very complex and tortuous and intertwined, and you have to follow the paths right down to get to the end of them. So you can't understand it. So I think from this you can have an idea that if you have a very large entity to hold together, as in America or as in China, you really need to simplify the central features of it, otherwise it'll split apart and be too diverse. And certainly if you apply this principle, you can see that there are 8 or 9 simple features of China which are very old, some of them thousands and thousands of years old, like the language, and most of them going back at least 2,000 years to the founding of China as an entity by the first Qin emperor. And these features, once you understand them, you can understand China. The first is the language. It is the only surviving example of a picture language, pictograms or ideograms, in the world on a large scale. And that it has survived and it is used by the Chinese is absolutely extraordinary. But it is the simplest of languages because it's basically a set of pictures with some refinements. And it's universal. Anyone in China can read, and was taught in the past to read some simple Chinese characters, and that unified China more than almost anything else. It was traditionally unified by a very simple legal system, very elementary, basically very harsh. If you offended against a set of basic principles, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not murder, and so on, you were punished very, very severely. Very little procedure, court procedure, no lawyers, and so on. And the whole thing based on the degrees of kinship separation of the people involved. And so it was a punitive but simple and effective legal system to keep the population orderly. A third feature, which was set out by the Qin emperor and then elaborated, was a very simple political structure. The emperor at the top then delegated down and down and down and down and down in 4 or 5 layers, which is still the system that China operates now, with the central committee and then going down through provinces and districts and towns and to the villages, 5 levels. And that imperial administrative system and bureaucracy has survived for over 2,000 years. Incredibly simple, incredibly powerful, based on education rather than on wealth and birth position. and the great imperial bureaucratic system of China is what holds it together in the past and what holds it together in the present. At the bottom level, the important units were the villages and the kinship groups, and these, even to this day, are very, very important. Traditionally, the family system all over China, apart from some of the minorities, was based on descent, that is, who you think you are related to, through males. So you had groups or clans or lineages based on descent through males, and you could count back your ancestral line, and there were ancestor halls and lineages and books of ancestors, and so you were a member of the Wang or the Shu or the Shi clan, and you couldn't marry anyone within that clan. You had to marry outside it, and it was very male dominated and again very powerful. The clans were the basic units of the political and social world, and the family was all important. You were born into a family, you were married by the family, you were buried, and your ancestral spirit was nurtured by that family. So it's a very powerful and uniform Han family system. And the local communities were also, the villages were also largely self-ruling and very powerful. And you can see that to this day in that people in China, wherever they are, will think back to their hometown or their home village and where they came from. Another form of uniformity, which is very ancient, is in the philosophical systems. It has the most ancient of philosophical systems, a nature religion, Taoism, which is like Shinto, which basically imagines the world to be unseparated. Humans and spirits and powers and nature are all bundled up in yin and yang and feng shui and so on, so that we are not separated out. And this ancient mystical shamanic system, which also persists in Japan, is underlying China through thousands of years, back to the I Ching and before, and persists to this day, as I've discovered. It's combined with other ancient philosophies. Confucianism, which is 2,500 years old, is still the bedrock of China in its philosophy. And then Buddhism, which is 2,000 years old, more or less, in China. And then ancestral respect. These systems coexist, and they underpin the thinking systems of China as they did 2,000 years ago and up to the present. Again, this is related to the arts and aesthetics. If you look at Chinese art, whether it's poetry or painting or music, the forms are very ancient. The ancient forms of music persist as they do of poetry and painting, and they've persisted for thousands of years. They're always changing, but they are uniform. When the Qin Emperor set up a unified China, he was ruthless in expunging all differences and setting up common standards. So he set up common standards of weight and distance and volume. So all the measures and underlying ways of organizing life were unified over 2,000 years ago, and those have continued to this day. And this also applied to the currencies, the very simple, minutely divided currencies of China, the capex and the tiny little currency items, continued right up until the 20th century in China. And so people could exchange and buy and barter, which they did in vast volumes, all over China, using a common currency. So in many ways it was a vast yet immensely simple system which we can understand if we understand the levers and the threads which run through it. In that respect, it reminds me also of the British Empire, which again, because it was so huge at one time, about a fifth of the world's population, had to have at its core a great deal of simplicity. And so in the British Empire, for example, in India, vast continent, many times larger than Britain, it was unified by English law and one legal system. Local customs, lots of local traditions and customs, but a unified common law, a common currency, English currency, a common political system, allegiance to Victoria and so on, a common language, that is the ruling language of English, although, of course, most people spoke other languages as well, and even a common sense of heritage. Many schools in India, to my surprise, were still teaching their children that they were and somehow linked to the great English poets. The Wordsworth's daffodils were a great favourite in many schools. This kind of unification, of course, you find perhaps even more extremely in the French and Spanish and other empires, where you become French or Spanish and you speak the language and you learn the customs of the motherland and you have a passport to the motherland. The British both unified and kept their distance and didn't put such pressure. But there is a deep unity, and anyone anywhere in the British or French empires had some affiliation with people elsewhere. And that reminds me of the unity of China, which once you've grasped hold of, a combination of simplicity and unity and great longevity, 2,000 plus years in most respects, shows why it's so strong, unified and tough, and has persisted.